Hello, Cornerstone. It's Tim Kinsey, and I get to bring you our spiritual vitamin for today. And we're going to look at a parable that is very familiar to all of us, one that we've looked at several times before. But I recently read a devotional that put it into a very different perspective for me. It dug a little bit deeper into one of the nuances of the parable that Jesus told over in Luke 10 about the Good Samaritan. So, starting in verse 33, it says, "But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, 'Take care of him, and whatever you spend, when I come again, I'll repay you.' So which of these three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" So prior to this, a priest sees a man that has been beaten. A man was going about his way and was beaten by robbers and left naked on the street. And a little bit later, a priest comes by and crosses the street and goes by on the other side of the road. And a little bit later, a Levite who is of the religious order but just a little bit lower than a priest does the exact same thing. Maybe he was following the priest's example. Maybe he saw the priest up ahead and decided, oh, that's what I should do. I shouldn't get involved. But either way, he crossed the street and did nothing for him. But then, in the parable, a Samaritan comes. And as you may have heard, Samaritans were looked down upon on the Jews. And he had no qualms about being perceived as unclean by approaching this man that was beaten, bloody, and naked. And he takes care of him. And one of the things that came up in the devotional I read that seems significant that I never really picked up before. So the first two guys are religious. The Samaritan doesn't really say anything about what he believes, but it says he bandaged the man, pouring on oil and wine. And so when I read this recently, I thought, okay, maybe that's just how they killed germs back then. But I thought that was a little strange, that oil and wine is what he poured on the wounds. Maybe that's just what he had. But it sticks out because the Jews specifically mentioned it after the priest and Levite had failed to do anything for him because they didn't see mercy and compassion as acts of worship. In the Old Testament, when a priest or a Levite was performing an act of worship, they poured oil and wine on the sacrifice before it was burnt and given to God. So it's significant that someone who didn't have a religious background used elements of worship to take care of somebody who was his neighbor. And the whole theme of this comes from a question about who is my neighbor. And at the end of the parable, Jesus asks those that are listening to him who was a better neighbor. And all the people agreed it was the Samaritan and the one who took care of his needs. And it made me think about our acts of worship. A lot of times we can get really consumed over the acts of worship, whether it's reading our Bible or praying or going to virtual church or being kind to people or confessing our sins or any one of the things that we know that are acts that we should do. But in its simplest form, what Jesus was telling us is our purest action of worship. He says another place is to take care of orphans and widows in their distress. But here, he's giving the message of the acts of worship, pouring the oil and the wine on some poor guy who had been taken advantage of. That was more of an act of worship than whatever the priest was on his way to do and whatever the Levite was on his way to do. So as we go about our day today, we may be on our way to do something very important, maybe an important religious, spiritual, or Christian act, but maybe God put something in our way that will help us really put our Christianity into action by what we do and what we say and how we treat our neighbor. I hope you have a great day.